Hey everyone, it's Zach here. Today I'm going to walk through a new automated report that I built for gathering data about last logins and tying that to home directory information as well. The idea here is to to understand if you have hosts out there in your environment that are accessible to many different users, to figure out who's using them, kind of how they're using them, and you can determine a path forward after that. But the last command, what it does is it'll go and give you effectively information about the last time various users have logged in, right? So we got our last login times, log out times, currently logged in users, and things like that. And what I've done in addition is I've gone and grabbed home directory sizes and kind of tied those, basically joined the data together based off of the user and generated a report from that. This came from a customer request where they were trying to build out a report like this to determine, are there extraneous users that don't necessarily need access and things like that, or lingering data out there that doesn't need to exist. So the way that I do it is I'll talk a lot about this JC library, which is, I've used it in posts in the past, and there is a nice filter plugin built around it in community.general. And JC basically provides structure to raw output from common command line tools. So in the references, actually, I do encourage you to go down and look at the JC documentation, because it has a massive list of all of the different tools that it has parsers for. And you can actually dive into the documentation for a particular parser. So for instance, when I was doing this for last, the way you do it here is I've got my playbook snippet. I'm going to use Ansible built-in command to call last. And I can use options and some other things like this, so I'm just limiting the records here. But I can look at the documentation to see, okay, what options for last does JC support. That's how I know I can use, the dash big F and dash W, the F being the full date. And then the second piece there, just limiting the records, right, doesn't affect the ability to parse. But this is how a lot of the JC interactions will work, right? So in my case, I'm using .jc and I'm giving it last, and that's telling it which parser to use, right? If I was using a different command, I would just change the preceding step to not be using last, maybe something like dig, right, or else off, and then I would just change what I'm passing to JC, and it would be able to parse that and give me out structured data. So here's an example. So this will be a list of, like, let's say I did max records of 100 and I actually have a lot of login data. I would get a list of 100 records, and here's an example of the payload that I would get back per record, right? So I've got my login, and I have it in seconds as well, and I've got my log out as well as the user, and the duration. There's also, the data can slightly change, right, if the user is still logged in. I think there's a record that will show you, still logged in. So the next thing I did is I went ahead and I augmented that data, right? So I wanted to say, okay, I've got the last login data, and I've got this list of records, and in there I have the username. And here what I do is I go ahead and construct from the username the home directory, and I use du to grab the size of that home directory. And you'll notice here, like, I am hard coding, /home/user, right? If you're using a different pattern, or maybe you have some unexpected patterns, which is not typical, there are other ways, right? You could actually glean the home directory from various files on a Linux system. In my case, I want to keep it simple. I know it's /home/user, so that's how I'm doing it here. So this first step is actually getting the data. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and parse that out, right? Because it gives me some raw output. And to be honest, I didn't even check, and I probably should have, but there might be a JC filter for DU. So I probably could have made this a little bit easier on myself. But I went ahead and wrote the JSON query that goes and grabs the standard outline, which has the actual size of that directory, which worked fine for me. And then I went ahead and set this fact. So setting this fact is important for using the role that I built to generate the actual report. And I'll have a separate blog post to talk about more in detail about how to use the role in general. But just know that for using it, in this case, you basically set a fact for each host that you want to report on. And that fact contains the data that the report will use to generate, right? So in this case, it's last report data. So what I do is I take my output from JC, I pass it to this filter plugin called Last Reportify, and that's custom. So what I want to note there is, like, whenever I'm doing some more sophisticated joins that I don't want to use kind of some crazy JSON queries and map filters and things like that, I want to keep it a little bit simpler. I'll write a custom filter plugin and I'll implement it in Python just to save myself some time and also some clarity in the playbook. So there's no magic there necessarily. I did write some code, and you can find it in the actual source for this post. So if you want to go to the source, you can find it in the filter plugins directory. So what that does is it gives me the structured data, and then the last thing I need to do is generate the report, which I do by calling my role, which is called reporting table per host. I have linked here as a related post my tabular report. So this is actually the tabular report extended to be passed more than one host, right? So it'll create tables per host effectively, right? Just the name tells you that, and you can give it some other information. But the key point is, right, that table data fact. So we're saying that last report data contains the report information for each host that we're going to report on. So quickly, I'll pop over to the general JC documentation, and what I really want to highlight here is, again, this is in references, but they've got links to this JC library, which will take you to GitHub, and that will have a lot of that information about what plugins, what shell commands does it support, and then you can click in and get more details about the usage of each of those shell commands. And then link to the playbook itself, right? We pretty much walk through it all. You'll see here I have some variables commented out just to give you an idea of what you can do to variabilize the behavior. And then here in zjleblanc.reporting, you can find the role documentation. And again, I'll be making a separate post to show how to use this, but I do put extensive examples in here, if I scroll all the way down, of really how to use this role to make it easier for you to consume. So top over into AAP, and I've got my job template where I basically pass in just a few of those variables. I'm going to run it on a couple hosts in my environment. Again, these hosts are what I'm going to report on. And I have this host called Camp where I have a bunch of users logging in and out, and then I have another host there called Fedora that I'm going to run against. Really, I'm just doing that to show you what it looks like to have more than one host. My Fedora box doesn't have a lot of users. Then I give it a report title and description. Again, those are optional. You'll get a generic value if you don't do that. Report server is important. So that is, where am I going to publish this report once it's generated? And for me, I have a Raspberry Pi that I use to host reports.autodotes.com, right? And that's where I'm going to place this, and you can see my destination. So the destination there is the actual path on that server itself. And then of course, I override last records max. Again, optional. I think it defaults to 100, but I said, I can go ahead and do 500. So let me go ahead and launch this. And when I launch this, remember what it's going to do is it's going to go to each of those hosts. It's going to run last, and then it's going to go through all those users, and it's going to get their home directory information. And then at the very end there, right, it just generates a report on that remote host. So that was successful. What I can do is I can go over here. So this is my last login report, which is also linked in the references of the post. You'll notice here it looks like it's last run on 9/9, so let me refresh. And you'll see here that we just published a new version. That time is in UTC, so for me it's 9:30 Central. And this is the generated report. All right, so I think it's pretty cool. I've got all the different users and their recent logins, as well as the size of their home directory. Of course, this could be more interesting if you have some real users out there interacting, making changes. You could see kind of a timeline of like what's changing in their home directory over time. For me, I've got some kind of automated login happening here to make the data somewhat interesting. But you'll see the home directory size is staying pretty static. I can also come in here and search, right? So if I'm looking for a particular user, I can filter it down, right? So MCers, or I think I have a Z, yeah. So things like that, that comes out of the box with the report. And this report is a statically generated single HTML file. So pretty easy to place on a report server and just open up. It does have a few dependencies on Bootstrap. So if you don't have access to the internet where you're publishing this, all you have to do is actually include, you do have to modify the template a little bit, but then include the Bootstrap, CSS and JavaScript libraries on your report server, and you could leverage the same styling. The other thing you'll have here is, of course, there's some sorting and filtering here. Let me go back to user, and then I have my two hosts, right? So I could run this on an infinite number of hosts, and if I click on Fedora, it'll actually swap me to my Fedora table. Again, I only have one user there, and not a lot of interesting data, but just wanted to show the ability to swap between hosts and see kind of what's out there in your environment. So hope you enjoyed this, and let me know if there's any questions. And again, stay tuned if you're interested in more details on like how to use the table per host role. but it's going to be quite similar to my other reporting roles, such as table, which I showed in the related post, as well as like fact reporting. Thanks for listening.